In September of 2023, last year, an incredibly notable tree was chopped down. It was an act of vandalism which saw the end of a tree which symbolised so much for so many for so long. Understandably, there was a huge outcry, rage, devastation and even shock at its destruction. This was a tree which has stood for nearly 150 years in an incredibly prominent location. I am of course talking about the felling of the Sycamore Gap tree, and look, at the time I didn't make any content about this, but we're now a year on and it's kind of come to the forefront of my mind. I've been having some thoughts about this, and as I've been thinking about it a little bit deeper, I think there's some layers to this which you might not have considered, and I want to talk about them in this video. So my name's Rob and I create videos here at Leave Curious about nature restoration. The core idea of the channel is to tell the many amazing stories of nature restoration, to fundamentally connect those who care about and those doing nature restoration work. And so often at the center of my videos, it's trees. I love trees. Before I was doing YouTube, I was working as an arboriculturalist, and I spent my days looking at big old trees and young trees as well, trees of all shapes and sizes. All of this is to say is that I love trees, and when I heard about the Sycamore Gap being felled, I was as angry, I was as shocked, I was as dismayed as anybody else. But before we get too emotional about this, let's start with the facts. The Sycamore Gap tree is, well, a sycamore tree. It's a species of tree which isn't native here in Britain, although it is naturalised and widely spread. And I say is and not was because the Sycamore Gap tree is actually still alive, although how we once knew it as that beautiful single stem tree, that is gone forever. It was planted around 150 years ago by the then landowner John Clayton. He intended for it to be a landscape feature situated right in the middle of two hills right next to Hadrian's Wall. And his intentions certainly came to be. This tree was arguably one of the most famous trees that we have here in Britain. It's a tree that is one of our most photographed. It's been depicted in mainstream media. It's even won awards. It really is one of our most famous trees that we have here in Britain. The Sycamore Gap tree, I think, really represented everything that we love about trees. It was old, it was tall, it had that beautiful symmetry of its crown, and then of the symmetry of where it stood in the landscape between those two hills. I believe that this relationship between humans and trees is something which runs incredibly deep. On a physical level, they provide us with the oxygen that we breathe, and we provide them with the carbon which they need. But I think there's even more layers to this. That feeling that you get when you wander through an ancient old forest, or you give yourself time to look up at a beautiful old tree like the Sycamore Gap? Well, those feelings, these are chemicals which are being released in your brain. The happy hormones are releasing and the stress hormones are decreasing. This is something which has actually been studied, and it's actually something which has been measured. I think that there's a lot that we can and indeed need to learn from trees. And I think it's this deep curiosity and appreciation that we have for trees. It's this that made it so hard when we learned that the Sycamore Gap was felled. On the morning of the 28th of September 2023, news spread that the tree had been chopped down overnight. Amidst the shock and outrage, a police investigation was launched, and I believe that this is one of the first times that a tree had actually been forensically tested. Trees tend to stay out of trouble. And back in April this year, 2024, two men were charged with the illegal felling of the tree. They're actually still on trial, and there'll be hearings at the end of this year. Using something known as the capital, this is the capital assessment value of amenity trees, you're able to get a monetary value of a tree. And this considers the condition of the tree, the state of the tree, its position in the landscape, its position in culture and in history. This was applied to the tree, and the value which came out was at £622,191. And as the tree fell, there was also some damage done to Hadrian's Wall as well. And as I say, the two men which have been accused of felling the tree, they are still under trial, and until that finishes, we can't really say much more about those men. But what about the tree itself? What's happened to the stump? What's happened to the wood that was left there after it was felled? Well, the stump itself is beginning to regrow. It's beginning to sprout back. I mean, like a tree of that size, a sycamore tree, in fact, any tree, they are incredibly resilient. Although it was violated and it was entirely chopped down, it will begin to put on new growth, and it is. Now, the tree's been managed by the National Trust and it's got a little like wooden fence around it right now. I just hope that the tree is just able to grow back as it pleases. But to commemorate the tree, seed was actually taken from the Sycamore Gap tree itself and they've been grown on as seedlings. And the idea is that 49 saplings will be dispersed around the country in memory of the tree. The 49 is significant because that is how many feet that the tree stood. And the woods, the main stem of the tree and the branches of the tree, this has been taken away and it's been stored so that in time it can be created into a sculpture to also commemorate the tree. That's what's happened. That's the facts. What I want to do now is kind of discuss my feelings around the Sycamore Gap tree. Now, we're a year on. If I go back to how I felt when it initially happened, I was as shocked, I was as dismayed, I was kind of heartbroken, really. Like many people, I just couldn't believe it. If there's one thing which comes out of this trial, if there's one thing that I want to know from the people that did it, is I want to know why. It's probably going to be the most unjustified thing you've ever heard because, how could you possibly justify it? I just want to learn from someone like that, like, why would you want to do it? And while I think that, the outcry and this response that we saw is justified, I think that now I thought about this a little bit more, I think it's revealed something about human nature, about human culture and the way that we perceive the landscape. I think that we are losing the forest for the tree. And what I mean by this is that this huge response that we saw, this huge outcry which we saw to the felling of the Sycamore Gap tree, you've got to remember that this is just one tree. All over the world, all over the country, especially here in Britain, we have a significant amount of old, ancient and veteran trees. Near enough every day, there's a tree which is being threatened to be cut down. There's ancient woodlands which are being threatened to be cut down by us because we want to develop, because we want to move forward. And you just don't hear about these trees. You don't hear about this in quite the same way. Even on a local scale, it's really hard to seem to get the public, to get the media to really care in the same way that we do for the loss of the Sycamore Gap. And, if we look back in the past, if we look beyond the life of the Sycamore Gap, if we go back centuries, if we go back thousands of years, how many amazing trees, how many ancient forests have been cut down by humans with axes? How many have we lost throughout time? And I just find it a little bit hard that we don't mourn the loss of this in the same way that we do for a single tree. And look, I know why this is. It's because we've got no personal connection to stuff we've never experienced. Like, how could we possibly have a connection to forests which were lost thousands of years ago? And where the Sycamore Gap tree stood, while it was almost a picture perfect photo, the symmetry of the tree and the symmetry of the hills, that landscape that it stands within, that is a heavily degraded landscape. Trees aren't meant to stand alone. Trees are meant to stand together. If you've ever had the pleasure of visiting a remnant pocket of truly ancient woodland where trees have stood for thousands of years, you begin to get an idea of what's missing from Britain. The truth is that we've forgotten what Britain once looked like, what large parts of it could still look like. The habitat you're seeing here is temperate rainforest. It's arguably one of the most captivating habitats we have in Britain, but it covers less than 1% of our land area. And that 1% is fragmented, isolated pockets. We believe that this habitat once covered around 25% of the UK, but you know, we chopped it down because we saw it as unproductive. Why aren't we mourning the loss of Britain's lost forests? You know, I think if you go down this route, you know, I'm no pessimist, I'm really not, but I think it's quite easy if you go down this route to start feeling really sad. You know, these feelings which we felt about the Sycamore gap tree, I think we should begin to extend this to the rest of our landscape. We should be asking questions about the state of nature here in Britain. And really, I believe we should use these negative feelings, you know, this despair that we feel. I think we should, you know, use this as fuel to move forward, to make plans, to rewild and restore and really replenish the British landscape. The amazing thing about natural systems, the amazing thing about forests, the amazing thing about trees is that they are incredibly resilient. I mean, just look at the Sycamore gap tree. It hadn't even been a year and it was beginning to sprout up and regrow. In my work, I've realized that we make the choices, people make the choices, you know, whether if you're an evil person that thinks it's okay to destroy a tree like the Sycamore gap, or maybe if you're a person which has dedicated their life to restoring nature. Humans, we make the choices, and you know, I think that while we can't let these people get away with doing horrendous things like felling a tree like the Sycamore gap, I hope they get what they deserve. We also need to put all of our energy and all of our focus in to nature restoration. If you're interested in learning more about nature restoration, then please make sure that you do subscribe to Leave Curious. If you want to keep watching the channel, then check out the video that's on the screen now. But in the meantime, thanks for watching. Leave Curious.